Hey, Nebraska fans. The Scarlet Shoot-Around Pod is happy to return our title sponsor, Tax and Business Consultants. So while you're cheering for the Huskers in 25 and 26, they've got your businesses back. With locations in Blair, Columbus, and Lyons, they've got you covered with expert tax planning, bookkeeping, and payroll services. Whether you're a small business owner or managing your personal taxes, let them take care of the numbers so you can focus on what really counts, like Nebraska going undefeated in non-conference play for the first time in 100 years. Visit www.taxandbusinessconsultants.com today and score a win for your financial future. Being charged with a DUI or criminal matter is one of the most stressful moments anyone can face. Your license, career, and reputation may all be on the line, but you don't have to go it alone. At the law office of William M. Kurtenbach, we understand what's at stake. Our attorney has years of experience handling DUI and complex criminal cases, protecting clients' rights, challenging evidence, and fighting for the best possible outcome. Every case deserves a strong defense. Don't wait until it's too late. Call the law office of William M. Kurtenbach today, serving Platte and surrounding counties. Call 402-249-5154 today or visit lawofficeofwmk.com.
You are listening to a Scarlet Shoot-Around exclusive interview. Here are your hosts, Blake and Mike.
Welcome into this special guest edition of the Scarlet Shoot-Around podcast, presented as always by our title sponsor, Tax and Business Consultants. Make sure to visit them online this tax season for any tax planning, business consulting, or payroll needs that you may have at www.taxandbusinessconsultants.com. Welcoming in again our guest of this episode, 801 Bracketology. How are you doing tonight, my friend?
I'm doing great, guys. It's so good to be on, and I really appreciate you guys having me.
Absolutely. So, going into what Nebraska has done, obviously, I'm sure has been a greater shock to a lot of bracketologists in some ways more than anybody. But before we get into any of that stuff, 801, what got you into studying bracketology and analytics, and how long have you been doing this?
This is going to be my 6th year doing bracketology. I really got into it during right before COVID started, actually. So in the 2020 season that ended up getting canceled. And I am a local to Utah, grew up, born and raised in Utah. I'm a huge BYU college basketball fan. And really the love for college basketball overall started developing during the Jimmer era. And I had the chance to see Jimmer in San Diego State, that famous game where Jimmer dropped 43 points on San Diego State at home in the Marriott Center. And I got to be there, witness it live. And it was like an immediate addiction to college basketball. And it has been ever since. And so right before COVID started, found out that there were multiple guys kind of doing the bracketology thing and thought to myself, hey, I think I could do that. And it turned out to be a lot more complicated than what I thought it was, but it was really entertaining at the same time to figure out all the different things that go into it and to get to know all of the teams around the country. And I just absolutely love it. It's a community that is just unmatched across social media. And so great community to be a part of, great thing to do with my spare time. I love college basketball.
Obviously, being Nebraska basketball fans, we're not always in tune with bracketology, and maybe the last handful of years, definitely more so, but most of the years, not so much. So getting to, me and Blake getting to hang out and meet some of you guys that do this has been really, really cool. Speaking of Nebraska, obviously, the big topic of discussion here, you look at their resume right now, they sit 15-0, 4-0 in the Big Ten. I mean, is there anything in particular that really sticks out to you about what they have done so far?
So there's a lot to like about Nebraska, and I'll try to break it out into buckets. I don't know how many buckets there will end up being because there's so much that's impressive about Nebraska and their resume right now. But I think bucket number one, when you look at Nebraska, is their high-end wins right now. And I think that's really critical in part because they didn't have the most impressive non-conference schedule. If you were to compare them to the other about top 20 teams in the nation, that non-conference schedule looks a little bit shady compared to the others. But what they have done is they've collected a couple good non-conference wins, and then they started out conference play by going and beating Illinois at Illinois, by beating Ohio State now at Ohio State, and by winning a huge home game against Michigan State, and then blowing out Wisconsin as well. They've packed some of these really good wins early in their schedule, and it's really impacted the way that their resume can be viewed. And I think that's big, especially here at the start of the season, because Nebraska is beating top end teams, and they're proving that they can do that in a convincing fashion, which has undoubtedly a huge impression on the committee's opinion of them and what they'll look like come March. So that's kind of bucket number one. Bucket number two is just where the metrics have them in general. And so what we have in college basketball, you have a few what we call results-based metrics that we look at, and then a few predictive metrics that we look at. Your results-based metrics, or your wins above bubble, which is giving you kind of your wins above the average bubble team. And right now they sit fourth in wins above bubble. In ESPN's strength of record, they sit third. And then in KPI, which is the other results-based metric, they sit fourth as well. So they are top four in every single result-based metric, which, if you were to look at that alone, tells you that Nebraska is one of the four best teams in the country. And I think the record matches that at this point. What we also have then is predictive metrics. And on the predictive end, we look at BPI, KenPom, and Torvik. Those are the three predictive metrics that go onto the committee sheet. The caveat here is that Nebraska is going to be a little bit lower in all three of those metrics, but there's still preseason bias that's kind of baked into those, and preseason rankings that are baked in there. And if you were to look back at where Nebraska started the season, they were above 50 in every single predictive metric. Right now, they are 20th in KenPom, 21st in Torvik, and 22nd in BPI. And so that tells you in all of the predictive metrics, which measure your efficiency, your points per possession, they have made a 30-place improvement in every single one of those at minimum this year. And that's huge, because what you'll end up with a lot of times at this point of the season is teams that have good resumes but really lack on the efficiency side. And Nebraska is really strong in both.
Yeah, you mentioned Nebraska is one of the top four teams. I think we're going to strip that out of the podcast and just spread that to our followers with no context included. And we're just going to call that the interview. I think we're done here. No, just kidding, obviously. But, it's been a magical start to the season. And, the fans have, in a lot of ways, been starstruck by what has come to fruition. Is I think preseason Nebraska, KenPom projected to be like 9-11 in the Big Ten and, 18 or 17 wins overall. And, they already have 11 stacked up, and they're projected, I think, in a lot of ways to end up in the mid-20s. So, but when you look at Nebraska on a more granular basis, I'm not entirely sure how many of our games that you've watched, start to finish, but outside of, giving up a lot of threes on defense, what are one or two of the weaknesses you notice about Nebraska on the court?
So I'm going to take credit here and give myself mantra that I was one of the first believers in Nebraska this season. And a lot of it has to do with them playing BYU in the preseason and just looking lights out against BYU in the preseason. Threes from all over the court, from every single player. They were fantastic, a really fun watch. And I know, being on social media, that caused a little bit of panic in BYU fans because Nebraska wasn't supposed to be great this year. But when I watched that game, I was like, oh, Nebraska's got it. This is the team. And so I was anticipating not this exactly, but I was anticipating a good Nebraska team this year, and they've lived up to the expectations. You did mention three-point defense, which I think is minimal at this point. I'm not too concerned about that for Nebraska. Well, I'm a little more concerned about, and it's two areas that kind of roll up into one. Based on seeing that preseason game against BYU, I don't think Nebraska has fully lived up to their three-point shooting on offense yet and their capability. I think they rank like 188th or something like that in three-point percentage up to this point of the season. And I think they've got the shooters to be better than that. I think there's 4 Nebraska players that are kind of hovering in the mid 30% range that have the capability to shoot 40% from three. And so that's something that I'd like to see them expand here as they get into conference play, is taking more threes, hitting more threes, because that'll especially become critical tournament time. And the second component of this is I think that Nebraska struggles a little bit on the offensive rebounding end. And they get out athleticized by other teams that are super athletic when it comes to rebounds. Combine those, and often what you'll end up with is you're missing a lot of shots and you're not getting second chances. And I think that could be an area that's challenging for Nebraska the further we get into conference play. So I'm looking for them to make adjustments in both of those areas. And when I look back at the games that they've kind of struggled in, what I see in those is they've got 7 or 8 offensive rebounds for the whole game, and they've been out offensive rebounded by the other team. So hoping that they take more threes, make more threes, and get really hard on that offensive glass.
Great insight. And I think that's a lot of stuff that Nebraska fans that have been watching the team absolutely agree with. I know I find myself complaining to my wife mainly about their lack of offensive rebounding. So good to hear I'm not alone in that one. Right now, as we sit, Bart Torvik projects Nebraska to finish 25-6 overall. That'd mean 14-6 in conference. So hypothetically, if they go on and do that, only lose 6 games through the Big Ten conference schedule, do you have an idea of what kind of seed line we'd be talking about if they end up there? Again, 25-6 overall and 14-6 in Big Ten play.
25-6 overall and 14-6 in conference play would kind of lead me to believe that Nebraska is somewhere around the 3 seed line. And there's a chance that if they end up with higher, with some of those top end wins, that they could get up to a 2 seed. There's also a chance that if they don't make a run in the Big Ten tournament, that it ends up being a 4 seed. But I think that's kind of the range that I'm solidifying for Nebraska if they're able to keep this up and end up in that 25-6, 14-6 range, which would just be fantastic. I think that would blow some Nebraska fans' minds. For what it's worth, Ken Palm measures them in that same kind of projection, 25-6 and 14-6. So that's where things kind of stand today.
I think you just saying it has blown our minds. Saying that, yeah, I think it's pretty realistic. That's a 3 seed. You know, it's like talking to somebody that's not in our fishbowl and saying that is what really kind of is a reality check, I guess, in a lot of ways. Hill Varsity 5X says, what are the absolute must-win games that are left on Nebraska's schedule to maintain a geographically protected top 4 seed?
Well, there's a handful of games that they will absolutely have to win to maintain that positioning as a top 4 protected seed. One of the things that you commonly see among top 4 seeds is they do not lose those Q3 and Q4 games. If ever, there may be 1 or 2 teams that have earned a top 4 seed that have a Q3 loss, but have a plethora of Q1 wins that are really solid to make up for it. And so looking at kind of those Q3, Q4 range games that they have left, they have at Rutgers, they have got Oregon on the schedule, which could end up being Q3. Oregon does not look great so far, and that's coming up here next week. They've got Penn State and Maryland also on the schedule. Neither of those teams look particularly promising. And so I think winning those 4 games are critical to Nebraska maintaining that top 4 positioning on the seed line.
It's giving not Minnesota from last year, unfortunately. And as we all know, Nebraska ended up losing to Minnesota and missing out the tournament. But at least this year they've done enough work to give themselves a bit of a cushion to not even necessarily worry about missing the tournament. So hopefully they can pull those off, though. Talking about wins, games they need to win. Obviously, like I just said, Nebraska's done a lot of work, and you kind of touched on their non-conference already. You know, a couple of those wins now are kind of on that borderline between Q1 and Q2. So really, when you look at like those old wins and how they mature, looking better or worse when it comes to quad, how much weight is there really between like a Q1 win over net number 49 versus Q2 over net 52? Like, is there that big of a difference when the committee looks at that? Are they just looking at the quadrants, or are they kind of like going farther in depth and seeing where these teams are actually ranked?
That's a very good question. And I think the opinions may differ among bracketologists if you were to ask this question. Some of bracketologists would like to think that the committee spends more time than I think they do on these team sheets and to digging into really what the rankings are of those teams. I think for me, as I think about the committee sitting in a room together, I think the bucket of quadrants is the most important thing. And I think less important is the number that's attached to a team's name. And I say that for a couple reasons. Number one is the NCAA has very distinctly always said that the net is not a power ranking, it's a sorting tool. And so they are not attempting to power rank teams in the net. They're attempting to sort them into quadrants. The quadrant system is the entire purpose behind why the net exists. And so I think that's a huge deal. What you'll often see here in the last couple months of the year, and what I'm sure Nebraska fans will be doing, as you alluded to earlier, is hoping that some of those games remain Q1 or remain Q2, because I think that's actually very critical as to where Nebraska will end up as for seeding in the tournament. So what they do is in the first 2 quadrants, they divide those into 2 sections. So there's a Q1A and a Q1B and a Q2A and a Q2B. Obviously, you have quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, which we won't get too much into. Now, there's certain wins that fall into Q1A. For example, a win over a top 15 team in the net at home is a Q1A win. A win over a top 25 team in the net on a neutral court is a Q1A win. win on the road over net 1 through 40 is a Q1A win. Nebraska has a couple wins in the Q1B range right now over potential tournament teams that are right on the cusp of dropping down to that Q2, into that next quadrant. And those wins are over New Mexico, who's looked really good as of late, and over Oklahoma. I personally think that at least one of those two teams is going to end up being a tournament team, if not both. But with it being right on the cusp, gets a little bit into that danger territory of falling into Q2. And I don't think the committee will consider much if Oklahoma ends up net number 52 instead of 48. They're not going to look at that and say, well, it was almost Q1. No, it is Q2, and that's a Q2 win, if that makes sense.
Sounds like just more ammunition for Nebraska to pull out their Oklahoma sweaters and their New Mexico t-shirts here as we get into deeper conference play. Although I will say I don't think anybody's going to be rooting for Creighton regardless of where that falls in the quad system. That's like a line too far, a line in the sand that cannot be crossed, I think. Awesome. Well, we're about halfway through this, so we're going to take a quick ad break, and we will get back to this interview on the other side of the break.
If you're all in on Nebraska sports, you've got to check out 2cmerch.com. They've got Nebraska-themed apparel for all sports with design rooted in heritage, deep meaning, and true fans in mind. Whether it's game day or you're showing your loyalty year-round, 2C Merch has you covered, so make sure to visit them at twocmerch.com because great fans deserve great shirts. If you or someone you love has been hiding their smile, struggling with dentures, or putting off dental implants because of cost, this one's for you. Main Street Dental in El Dorado, Kansas, just outside of Wichita, is offering exclusive discounts for Nebraska ball fans, and they're even willing to help cover a hotel stay, despite being about 4 hours away. Dr. Nolan Andrews and his team are considered one of the top full-arch implant centers in the region, specializing in full-arch, all-on-X, and single dental implants. If you've been saying someday, or you know a family member or friend struggling to smile or eat, tell them to call Main Street Dental at 316-321-4222 and ask about the Nebraska Ball Fan Implant Program.
You are listening to the Scarlet Shoot-Around Podcast.
Welcome back into the Scarlet Shoot-Around Podcast with our special guest, 801 Bracketology. Real quick, I want to thank all of our sponsors. Our title sponsor, Tax and Business Consultants. As always, visit them online at www.taxandbusinessconsultants.com. The Law Office of WMK, where you can visit them at www.lawofficeofwmk.com for any Platte County law defense needs. 2C Merch, that's TWOCmerch.com. Dusty and his team and their custom apparel, as well as Dr. Nolan Andrews down in Kansas, taking care of any dental needs you may have. Okay, getting back into this, 801, Logan Collins and That Husker Fan asks, what does Nebraska have to do to end up on the 2 seed line, and would it take a run in the Big Ten tournament potentially to get there?
It's a fantastic question. And we talked a little bit earlier about kind of the projections and where they sit both in Ken Baum and Torvik right now. Those are 24-6 and 14-6 in the Big Ten. I think that to be sniffing the 2 seed line, Nebraska probably has to do a couple of the following. They probably have to finish 15-5 or better in the Big Ten. They probably have to make a run in the Big Ten tournament and win 2 or more games in the Big Ten tournament. And I'm going to include a third thing here. They still have 5 Q1A games remaining on the schedule. And I think they need to win 2 or 3 of those Q1A games. Those games are at Michigan, home against Purdue, home against Illinois, at Iowa, and at Indiana. Now, obviously, we don't know if all of those are going to remain Q1A throughout the season as we progress. But what will end up happening is some of those top-end teams that they're up against for a top 2 seed are going to pick up huge wins in the conference, in their respective conferences. UConn, for example, is going to pick up big wins over St. John's and Seton Hall, and SEC teams are going to pick up huge wins against each other and cannibalize each other. If Nebraska wasn't to pick up some of those top-end Q1A wins, what you end up doing is comparing them to some of those top teams that have those wins over the number 2 and 3 and 4 teams in the country. Right now, Nebraska's in a really solid position, having a win over net number 10 and net number 12, but would love to see them really solidify that resume with 2 or 3 more big wins in that Q1A range.
And they have an opportunity to do that, as you mentioned, on the road against Indiana here coming up on Saturday. So opportunity for the Huskers to tack one on. We'll see if Mikey can finally get a pick right. Corn J. Jose asks, if a Kansas logo was on Nebraska's resume, are they a top 5 seeded team? Has the UNC West Virginia situation last year set a premise for it?
I don't know if UNC West Virginia has set a precedent for that necessarily. I think that was a weird situation last year with UNC's athletic director being the chairman of the committee and the way that all unfolded. But, and I think I may surprise you with my answer here, but my answer is going to be yes. I think that Nebraska would be a top 5 team in the country right now if they had Kansas slapped on their school. And the reasoning behind that, I don't think it's a blue blood bias thing necessarily. What I do think it is that Kansas had a little bit more of the preseason rankings that were pulling behind them, where they were estimated to be like a top 10 team this year. And so they started out with those predictive metrics really, really high. And Kansas hasn't looked fantastic compared to what we hoped they would. They've kind of dropped some of those predictive metrics into the mid-teens. But if that was Nebraska and they started with like a top 10 predictive metric across the board in BPI, KenPom, and Torvik, they would be like a top 5 in all 3 of those right now compared with their top 4 resume. This would absolutely be a top 5 team right now if they had Kansas slapped on their name.
And that's the life of being the stepchild that Nebraska is. It's, we've had to live in Creighton's shadow for basically the last decade plus, and they've never really had any serious program success, at least since the early 90s. So that's just kind of a product of it. And here's to hoping that can change down the road. But truthfully, really not too surprised by that answer. 100%, like the logo in a lot of ways plays into who you can get as a player, which then in turn plays into, the quality of roster you can build, which then plays into your preseason predictive metrics, right? It's kind of a slippery slope that way. David in Lincoln asks, would Nebraska be a 1 or 2 seed if they did not struggle this year in some of their bye games?
This is a tough question to answer, but I do think that they would probably be a solid 2 seed in my bracket right now if they hadn't had those struggles against Winthrop and against South Carolina Upstate, both games that they won by less than 10 in the quadrant 4. However, I think that they have done enough to kind of offset that. I don't think that as we get towards the end of the season that's going to be something the committee's looking at being like, Nebraska could be a 2 seed, but they really struggled in a couple of those games. I think we're past that point right now. And Nebraska is going to have plenty of opportunities in the conference to make up for whatever that is sitting on their resume. But yeah, if they had performed a little bit better, you may see those predictive metrics, which measure your efficiency against those opponents. You may see those in the teens rather than in the low 20s right now, which would lead me to believe that they'd be a 2 seed right now, pretty solid on my bracket.
Well, that's disappointing to hear. Sure wish they could have won those games by more. But if they take care of business, it won't matter in the end, I suppose. Huskin Fanatic said, what are the most likely destinations for our first and hopefully second, if they win the first one, NCAA tournament games? Obviously, this depends a lot on seeding, but curious what you think.
You may not like my answer to this, but it's going to be really hard to predict where Nebraska is going to end up because the way that it works is each of the top 4 seeds kind of in order get geographical preference of location. So if Nebraska ends up being a 4 seed, it is like a guarantee that they'll have to travel somewhere far away from Nebraska, and probably the last preferred tournament site, which may be San Diego State. But if they were end up like a 3 seed, there's a good chance that they could end up in the Midwest, in Oklahoma City or in Greenville or in Buffalo, somewhere on the east side of the country. I think one of the challenges that they're going to face here is that there are several Big Ten teams that are kind of in the same geographical region that are vying for some of those geographical spots. And so Michigan, for example, Purdue, for example, a couple other examples that come to mind include Iowa State is up there right now. Vanderbilt's up there right now. Michigan State's up there right now. Illinois could be up there by the end of the season. All those teams kind of sit in that geographical region. And so it really would depend on where you finish among those teams. And that would be the highest preference you can get, is if you can finish on top of those teams, because you'll get geographical preference over them. But that's something that I'll be watching here towards the end of the season. And usually by about early March, we have a really good idea of where a team's going to end up playing. And so I'd love to get back to that individual, that fan, and to you guys whenever we kind of have a better idea of what that's going to look like.
So just as a follow-up, are you basically saying that unless you are a top 3 seed, it's kind of up in the air to where you could go?
Yeah, that's essentially what I'm saying is especially if you're a 4 seed, then you're just kind of left with whatever's left over for the geographical preferences after all the top 3 seeds have had their preference met. And even some of the 3 seeds in recent years have ended up with geographical locations that aren't really preferable to them, that are like their 4th or 5th most preferable because they're already taken by the 1 or 2 seeds. To really get into a location that you want, that is your top preference, that's close to home, you've got to be like a solid 2 seed. A high 3 seed, which I think is where Nebraska may end up, could look like the 2nd or 3rd most preferential for what Nebraska would prefer geographically.
So when you get all this into a bundle and you kind of look at Nebraska for what it is, both what they've accomplished already and what they potentially could accomplish or what they're projected to finish, what are your predictions, 801, for Nebraska's seed and chances at a run in March?
Like I said earlier, I'm going to predict that Nebraska continues the momentum, that they end up correcting some of the things that we talked about earlier with surrounding the 3-point shooting and the offensive rebounding, that they look more athletic and more competitive as the season goes on, despite how competitive they've looked thus far. And I'm going to say that they end up being a 3 seed after making a run in the Big Ten tournament, and that this is a legendary special team that Nebraska has this year. And so I'll pick them to finish as a 3 seed right now. I think the realistic range is anywhere from a 2 seed down to a 5 seed potentially, but I think they're pretty comfortable in that range right now. Obviously, it will largely end up depending what the matchups are as you get into March Madness, but this is absolutely a team that I could see making a Sweet 16 run, an Elite 8 run, and if they had the right matchups, a Final Four run is not off the table.
I mean, like Blake said earlier, it's great to hear this from somebody that's not like a Nebraska basketball homer, and obviously we say it all in our circles, and it's wild to think what a difference like 3 months makes. It used to be just getting to the tournament, and now we got a bracketologist on here saying the floor is kind of like a 5 seed and they have a pretty good chance of maybe making the second weekend. I don't know. Life comes at you fast in college basketball, I guess, and this has been one heck of a season so far. We appreciate you joining us, 801. Just for all the fans out there, where can they find you? Where can they find your coverage and all your bracketology updates at?
Absolutely. I can always be found on X at 801 Bracketology. I can be found at 801bracketology.blogspot.com. And I can especially be found on the Bracket Matrix, which I'm sure you are all watching at this point of the year. I rank really highly on Bracket Matrix as about one of the top 15 bracketologists in the entire country. And so give me a look there, follow me on X, and we'll watch Nebraska ride or die till the end of the season and see what the matchups are for the NCAA tournament and if they're going to be good.
It's been a very magical run, and we're really glad that you could join us, 801, to kind of put this crazy start of the season into perspective and what it could mean for the Huskers as we get into March. So again, thanks so much for taking some time to speak with us. I'm sure our fans will very much appreciate the insight, and we'll never going to say that it's the last time we'll talk this season. We'll see how everything develops. With that being said, for myself, Blake, co-host Mike, and 801 Bracketology, go Big Red.
Go Big Red, baby.